But my whole point with this is not so that you remember Hermann Balck necessarily, but that Balck's attitude represented the best of this Aufstellungtaktik that the Germans had. That we've gone over the maps ahead of time, you know what the end result of the mission is, go do it. And arguably that is what we have tried to do in the United States Armed Forces. Whether we're any good about it, well, that's a debatable point. It depends on the commander. Too many unit commanders are obsessive about controlling every single aspect of what they're meant to. And that ruins their ability to learn. So, all right. Is there a silver bullet in all this? What's the silver bullet, if there is one? Okay. Oops, I forgot my controller thing. Where is it? There it is.
If there is a silver bullet, who is the proverbial werewolf in the scenario?
Not quite what I was thinking. But anyway, again, from my former colleague, Dr. Chris Gable. And that's his example of Ardennes 1940 versus Ardennes 1944 is a perfect example of this. So after everybody going, oh my gosh, how'd the French let the Germans do that? We do almost the same thing in 1944. We put a green division covering a broad front in the Ardennes and say, no one could go through the Ardennes, even though just 4 years earlier, someone had gone through the Ardennes. And so during the Battle of the Bulge, they punched through the Ardennes, and they're making amazing headway, but what happens is the American army is motorized and mechanized. And so we were able to turn on a dime. Patton turns his entire army on a dime and attacks north, and we stopped the breakthrough in the Ardennes. There's a bulge in the line, but there's never a break in the line. Why? Because we have the technology, the motorization, the mechanization, to turn on the enemy and hit back. The French don't. Plus, they don't even have the doctrine to do this. I mean, as we talked about, they have that methodical battle doctrine, which is just worthless. So, how do we explain the outcome? France and Germany. At the political or the cultural level, France went into this war as a divided nation and a defeated nation. Okay, what do I mean by divided? The socialists and the right of center, small r Republicans, okay, those parties, that's kind of the division. The socialists on the one hand and the kind of slightly right of center, not fully fascists, but slightly right of center, small r Republican type guys are battling for power during the entire interwar period in France. In fact, it's so intense that after the defeat of France, one of the things that some people will say is better Hitler than Blum. Léon Blum was the head of the Socialist Party in France. There are French people who say, I'd rather have Hitler running the show than the socialists running the show. That shows you the level, the divisions in that society, where people said, I'd rather have a foreign power. Okay, let's leave aside the Holocaust and all that, because most of that is not well known. All right? But a foreign power running my country than an indigenous socialist. So that shows how deep those furrows were in that society. And they were defeated, because let's be honest, even though they won World War I, as we've talked about with the losses, that was a Pyrrhic victory. France won on paper, but in actuality, when you lose 2 out of every 3 servicemen are wounded or killed during the course of the war, it was horrible. So it's a defeated nation and it's a divided nation. The Germans, on the other hand, are united in that they want revenge. And as I've shown you, that feeling predates Hitler. There's this myth that, Hitler comes around and he just revs up the Germans if they want to go attack France again. No, the average German already wanted to attack France again. Hitler just gave them a means to do so, that's all. Okay? They are united in their desire for revenge. So that explains what happens on the political cultural level. At the strategic level, we have what is jokingly, this is another fake German word, okay? So Blitzkrieg wasn't real, this isn't real either. This is the newspapermen make this up. Sitzkrieg. Anybody know what that means, just out of curiosity? Sitting war. Because after the invasion of Poland, what do the French and British do? They just sit there and wait for the Germans to come at them. So a newspaper man in England comes up with this term. The Germans are doing a blitzkrieg, the French are doing a sitzkrieg. They're just sitting there, waiting. And there's this famous picture that has been reprinted a billion times. It's this French serviceman, and he's supposed to be on guard somewhere. It's not clear where it is, okay? It's probably not the German border. But there's this French soldier on guard, and he's found a chair somewhere. And he's literally sitting in a chair, holding the rifle in one hand, looking out at this open space in front of him. And again, it's probably not the German border. It's probably somewhere internal. But that picture has been republished so many times with the caption, "The French Sitzkrieg," you know. So I feel bad for whoever that poor French soldier was, because he just, you know, never stand if you can sit, you know. So anyway, on the other hand, the Germans have in mind this short, decisive war. They got it in Poland. They're going to get it in France. They get it in Belgium. They get it in the Netherlands. They get it in Norway. They get it in Denmark. They get it in all these other places. So they just keep doing it. It keeps working. And as long as it's short, the Germans are okay. Germans, historically, if you look from Frederick the Great onward, the Germans have never won a long war, unless you count the Cold War as a long war. They've never won a long war. They've lost every long war, they've won every short war. Napoleonic era, long war, they lost. World War I, long war, they lost. World War II, long war, they lost. They're only good at short wars. At the operational level, the French were very predictable. They had that methodical battle doctrine. They knew exactly what was going to happen 10 minutes into the battle, even though that's never what happened 10 minutes into the battle, but they knew what's going to happen. And they were completely inflexible. They were not trained to think outside the box. I know that's a cliche, okay, but it's true. They weren't trained to think on their own. They were trained to follow orders methodically. The Germans planned on using surprise and using opportunities that came to them. That's how they always were in this context. And then lastly, at the doctrinal level, I won't say tactical, but we'll say doctrinal level, methodical battle, which is based on artillery. That's it. That's all they got. Because again, they learned a lesson from World War I, and the lesson was artillery kills. So that's what we're going to use, lots of artillery. Okay, that was a true statement if we had, again, a war of not moving. Okay? If we had a stationary type war, if we had trench warfare again, absolutely, this works. If you have mobile war, this is a horrible idea. And again, for the Germans, we've got Auftragtaktik, mission orders, whatever you want to, and that's one translation of it. But whatever you want to translate it as, it's modern combined arms warfare. Modern combined arms warfare with taking the initiative. That's how I would describe it. And so when you compare these two, it seems obvious who's going to win. Now, again, if that guy doesn't lose the plans, well, he was dead, but if that guy doesn't crash and give the plans to the Belgians, who then give it to the French, and the main thrust had been through Belgium, where the French were expecting it, would the war have been different? Yes. Would the French have won? I don't know. Would the Germans have won? Maybe. I still think the Germans lose. If you're asking me my personal opinion, I think even if the plans don't get lost, there's no Ardennes thing, Heinz Guderian doesn't get what he wants. They go through Belgium and the Netherlands, French come up, the big battle's up there. I still think the Germans win. Because of all these things we're talking about. But is it the resounding victory? Is it 44 days to capture the whole country? No, I don't think that happens. And maybe a victory that isn't so resounding, again, as we kind of briefly talked about this last time, maybe that changes Hitler's mind about invading Russia. And who knows how many countless lives are saved by that. So, who knows? Who knows? We're speculating at this point. 2 more quotes, and then we'll wrap it up. Oh, here's another explanation about what happened. This is Lieutenant Colonel Williamson Murray. This is his take on it. I'd say that's a true statement.
Yeah.
Their willingness to learn from realistic experiment and combat. Whereas the rest of Europe is just saying, okay, we're never ever doing that again. The Germans are learning throughout that period. The French and the British and us are not. But then you have to add, they fight in Spain, and they get to test their stuff out. Remember that. We didn't talk much about the Spanish Civil War except for mentioning for air power, but they get to test their stuff in Spain, decide what works, what doesn't. They get to pick the date when the war starts. They get to pick where the war starts. They have some advantages by making those decisions. So, anyway. One last thought, again, from Alistair Horn, famous British historian. Again, this is what we were talking about. The Germans want revenge. The Germans want revenge. Everybody who came out of that World War I generation, not everybody, but a good chunk of the people who came out of that World War I generation want to get revenge. Please.
So the ex-sergeant is from the
German side.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
because they want like that.
Yeah, Jean-Paul Sartre is visiting Germany.
Oh.
He runs into this guy, they're talking, and this guy is just, whoop, you got it. And Sartre's like, oh no, we never want to do that again. That was horrible. Again, French attitude versus German attitude. No, when it happens, when the next war comes, we're going to retrieve our honor. So, I mean, this is why, I know I'm cherry picking. I got that, right? But this is so emblematic of the different attitudes of the French and the Germans. The French, oh no, we never want to do that again. That was horrible. Let's not do that again. The Germans, no, we're going to do it again. And this time I'm going to win. Okay, I know I'm cherry picking, but I think it emphasizes what we're talking about.
I know this can be a silly question, but France, I mean, like a geographical area is good for guerrilla warfare.
During the occupation?
Yes.
Yeah, there is a French resistance, but I have to tell you, you know, given the number of movies and things that use that trope of the French resistance, the French resistance is really mild until after June 6, 1944. And when the invasion is launched, then the French resistance really does rise up and they do some pretty amazing things. But from 40 to 44, the French resistance is pretty quiet, unless you're Jewish or a communist.
Okay.
Those two groups will have resistance groups that are just Jews or just communists. Sometimes they'll mingle the two. Those groups are pretty active throughout the war. But the average, they set up a resistance, and there is the Maquis, that's what they call the Maquis. They exist, but most of the ones who aren't Jewish or communists are very quiet. It's just stealing a few things. It's not widespread assassination. They're not doing that widespread stuff. It's very low key, just steal things once in a while here, small scale sabotage.
So they're not like
Bridges.
ambushes or anything like that.
There are some, but again, as I say, that's most of the Jewish resistance and the communist resistance
Okay.
during that occupation period. And then from when the invasion starts on June 6th, all of the resistance rises up because they think, okay, now we got the chance, now let's go.
Oh,
So they're very active then.
I don't know, but for me, I feel like that the French like, you know, the foreign government. Well, it's not like a brother.
Right. No, I understand what you're saying. I understand what you're saying, and to a certain degree, there's some truth to that. I mean, the German occupation of France wasn't that harsh if you weren't Jewish or communist. If you're just a regular French person, it's not that harsh of an occupation. Especially if you live in the countryside as opposed to the city. There's very few shortages in the countryside. Cities have a lot of shortages because you got issues of transportation, problems of transporting food from the countryside to the cities and so forth. But if you're a French person who lives in the countryside, the occupation is pretty mild. I have a colleague who wrote a book after he retired, and he made the argument that, and I think there's some truth to it, he claims he has the numbers, I don't know. More French people were killed in the liberation of France than in the occupation of France. He looked at French death totals from, 10 May 1940 to June 5, 1944. And then he looked at French casualty totals from June 6, 1944 until the end of German occupation. And he says more French people died during the Allies' invasion and the liberation of France than during the occupation, even though one is a year, the other is 4 years. And so he says that also influences like the anti-American attitude you get from some French people to this day. He says in some cases it goes back to that because they remember their family was killed by the Americans in an accidental bombing, an accidental artillery drop. Germans left them alone for 4 years. They were fine. And then the Americans show up and people start getting killed.
They just like forget that their country was taken over. Like, yeah, it's like the 4 years.
I'm with you, man. I'm with you. Okay, I'm with you. But
Advance, it's a different universe.
Right.
but you know, people's memory can be very selective.
It's weird too to think like what that's like for somebody back then. Like it's not completely up to date with everything, just living on a farm. You're kind of just like secluded, like to a certain extent.
Yeah.
I was watching a documentary on Vice about somebody who was like in Ireland. He's reporting on like something crazy that was happening there, like when he was a kid, like in the 70s, I think. But he was just saying like day-to-day life is so normal you wouldn't really know you're like in a militarized zone.
Yeah. Exactly. You know, and that's the thing. If you're out in the countryside and there isn't like a German unit station near you,
Just working every day.
yeah,
If I'm like 50 and I'm a farmer, I mean, life doesn't really change.
yeah, exactly. The cows have got to be milked. You got to feed the chickens. You got to do whatever in the field. It doesn't matter. Still got to do all that stuff. As long as the Germans aren't showing up and harassing you or stealing your stuff. Yeah, no, it's a good point. I want to end with a moment of Zen, and your moment of Zen is a rare picture. This is a photo of the 1940 Tour de France.
Who won?
All German.
Bicycle troops were actually a big thing in the mid 20th century. There was a lot of experimentation with bicycle troops.
You look
Their
this
bikes
way.
were nice.
What's that?
Their bikes.
Oh no, they're like really like, so the Swiss were the last army to have bicycle troops, and they finally got rid of their bicycle troops only in like the 1990s. And they were selling, you could get on some army surplus places, the Swiss army bikes. Now they were going for over $1,000. These were, I mean, this thing looked like it was an army issued bike. I mean, it was overbuilt in every possible way. I bet it was also heavy as hell. It wasn't like a light racing bike, you know what I mean? But yeah, it was really cool. It was one of those moments where I thought, That'd be really cool, but I don't have that kind of cash, so.
It's foldable because
Yes.
they use it.
Yes, now some of them, not all of them. Some of them are foldable, you're right. Not all of them. Yes.
I saw like a documentary like a year ago, like the Japanese forces during.
Yep. During the
They
Malaya
use it.
campaign.
Yeah.
During the Malaya campaign, the Japanese also used bicycles during the Malaya campaign, yeah. And what they did is when they're, because they were pneumatic tires, tires with air in them. So when the tires just went flat and had no more replacements, they just drove on the rims until the bikes wore out. I think the Swiss used hard rubber tires. I think it was solid rubber. I think that's what they did. Because that would make more sense if you're gonna use it from a military standpoint, because otherwise you're gonna be popping your tire all the time. You're gonna be driving over rough terrain. So a solid rubber tire won't be as efficient, but it will never go flat, so. Anyway, so let's look at the Eastern Front, okay? Now, you will remember, I mentioned briefly in the lesson on interwar mechanization that the Soviets have their own version of Blitzkrieg. Just like most people come up with their version of Blitzkrieg, and theirs was called Deep Battle. And here's a quote from their official regulations. I'm not expecting you to remember this, but just so that you can see that, yeah, they have their own version of it.
Oh yeah, that's the key issue. I use sometimes forces and then I have to spray, which is not like. I have to, focus.
Yeah. So it was under development, but they had a version of this. The problem is, it was Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who came up with this. He was their smartest guy, and he gets a bullet in the back of the head in 1937.
The Purge.
And suddenly, I want nothing to do with this document. This is gonna go into the trash, and if I survive that purge, I'm not gonna have anything to do with it. And how bad is the purge? The 1937-38 purge. How bad was it? Well, of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union, the most senior officers in the army, 3 of 5 are shot. I should say purged, okay? Because there were a few who did not get killed, a small number, but there are a few that don't get killed. 12 of the 15 army commanders, 57 of the 85 corps commanders, 110 of the 195 division commanders, and 220 of the 406 brigade commanders in the Red Army are purged.
I thought it was gonna be more.
You are bloodthirsty.
Well, it's solid. What do you expect?
It's 60% here. I can't do those numbers, but that's like 80%, I think. I mean, it's ugly. It's ugly.
You think they got the point?
I think they did. Yeah, I mean, again, and who is he targeting again? Which kind of officers are being targeted?
Smart ones.
The smart ones.
Then no-
Because if you're dumb, you're no threat to Joseph Stalin. You're no threat to Joseph Stalin. If you're smart, if you're dumb rather, smart, you're a threat. You could be planning to overthrow me. And this is projecting my feelings and my fears on you. Because if I was you, I'd do it. So if I would do it to you, of course you're gonna do it to me. Maybe I'm not a horrible person. Nah, everybody's a horrible person. You're planning it. I know you. Okay? And so the guys who are left over, especially when you look at the 2 marshals that survived, just not. One is a guy named Boudini, and Boudini is a fellow Georgian, because Stalin, is Georgian. He's not ethnically Russian, he's Georgian. And Boudini is this old cavalry commander from Tsarist days who somehow manages to survive. And he's just known, he's one of these guys that his solution to everything is draw your saber and charge. I mean, that's his idea of tactics.
Oh yeah.
If you see an enemy, draw your saber and charge. He survives, and he survives the whole thing. He doesn't die until like the 50s or 60s.
Well, aren't
Yes.
the people who survive the smartest one because they know how to close their mouth?
Well,
Stalin?
you wish. But unfortunately, no, they really were the dumbest guys. They really were the dumbest guys. How bad does it get? This is how bad it gets. Okay? The commander of a division is what we would call a 2-star general. So between a major and a 2-star general, there's a 1-star general, a full colonel, and a bunch of lieutenant colonels. So for a major to be in command of a division, a major is usually second in command of a battalion that's 500 guys.
Yeah.
He's now in command of a division of between 10 and 15,000, depending on the table of organization.
You must be really smart.
Thankfully, he was really smart, but junior enough not to get shot. By the way, the reason we know this is he becomes eventually a marshal of the Soviet Union in like the 60s. And he looks back at it after Stalin is gone and talks about how screwed up the army was 6 ways to Sunday back in those days. Like, we should never do that again. Because I remember showing up and I'm the division commander as the rank of a major.
So he doesn't have any, education, training?
Well, he does have training to be a staff officer,
Yeah, but no.
but no training to be a 2-star general. And it just shows you how bad it gets. Okay. Stalin doesn't just kill you. You are erased from history.
Are you gonna show us one without Stalin?
No, because Stalin is always there. Okay? If you've ever had to read for school, one of I think the greatest novels ever written, 1984, George Orwell's 1984. If you've ever had to read that for school, you will know that most of what happens in that book is based on the purges and things like that. George Orwell, which is not his real name, that's his pen name. George Orwell was originally a socialist who served in the Spanish Civil War alongside the socialists, came back from that experience like, I made some really bad decisions, I don't want anything to do with these people, and then eventually writes the novel in 1948. He just literally reversed the dates. That's why he picked 1984. Everyone was like, what was the significance? He was 1948, he just went like that and said 1984. And all of the things, not all, but a good chunk of the ideas that are presented in the novel, which is both a brilliant novel and a horrific novel. I mean, like, I'm never going to read it again. I've read it, it's a brilliant novel, but I don't want to ever read it again because it's so disturbing on so many levels.
Yeah, this torture scenes, like,
Yeah.
towards the end, where they just describe it so well, like how disorienting.
Yeah, yeah. And that whole post-book section talking about newspeak, do you remember that? Oh my gosh, that is so, it's right out of this. That eventually you just conform the language so that the language will never allow for rebellion. There's no words that would allow for something like that.
Oh, yeah.
Fun fact, that book is not allowed in schools anymore.
Some schools. Depends.
It's such an important book,
So-
it sucks.
Yeah.
And Mao was like Stalin? He
Mao
was
was,
the
no, Mao was not quite as bad in that sense. Mao did do purges occasionally, but Mao tended to, the people who suffered most under Mao were actually the common people.
Yeah.
And actually, technically, the people who suffered most under Stalin were the common people. But yeah, Mao did that occasionally. The
Cultural Reformation.
cultural,
When he like turned all the farm
yeah, it's
into
a
industrialized.
cultural revolution.
Oh, that was Reformation, maybe.
I'm not sure if it was religious or secular. But yeah, it's one of those two. Yeah, but he does it, see, Mao is more clever, I would argue, than Stalin. Stalin is just brutal, whereas Mao's more clever because he actually turned some of the people against other people. So that when the whole Cultural Revolution is over, he goes, I never intended for this to happen. And then he turns on his own wife, along with like 4 other members of the Politburo,
Yeah, I feel bad for this.
and said, oh, they're really the ones who are responsible for this, because I would never do such a thing.
Oh,
And so I would give Mao credit for being more clever than Stalin. Stalin's just brutal. He doesn't care about being clever. Whereas Mao, his reputation among the Chinese people remains untarnished until way later. He is seen as this savior of the nation, and oh my gosh, this was going on. I had no idea this was going on. You guys over there, you're responsible. And so they're put on trial, including his own wife. He throws his own wife under the bus. And they're put on trial. I don't remember if they're executed or just imprisoned. I can't remember how that worked. After, having like 1 million people be either killed or tortured or God
Didn't
knows what.
Stalin leave his son in prison?
Yeah. Stalin's son is captured during the German invasion of the Soviet Union. And the Germans say, okay, well, we'll offer you a trade. You give us one of our generals that you've captured, we'll give you your son. And he says, no, my son's a major. I'll trade you a major for a major. And
Instead, let him die in jail.
and what happens is Stalin's son eventually just kind of loses the will to live. He's in a concentration camp, but not a death camp. Because remember, there is a distinction between the concentration camps where they do labor and the death camps where they're literally there just to murder people. He's in a concentration camp, and he literally commits suicide by throwing himself on the electrified fence. Yeah, Stalin was a horrible parent. I'm sure you're not shocked by that. His daughter actually had a somewhat good relationship with him until she grew up, and then her first husband was Jewish, and Stalin was very anti-Semitic, and so he then arrested her husband and had him imprisoned and forced her to divorce him. And she's an interesting one. A professor I had at college at Loyola, who was a nun. She was a nun of the Sisters of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. She was a Soviet historian, and she knew Stalin's daughter very well. They were like friends for years. They had a falling out at some point over something, but Stalin's daughter eventually will, after her father's death, will defect to the West, and she actually converted to Catholicism. She became a Catholic, and she lived out the rest of her days in the West. She was an interesting woman. So anyway, Stalin again is, you're not gonna make it. You're not gonna make it. Now,
Those were real drawings, right?
yeah, well, the original one was a photo.
A photo, yeah.
And then that's
Yeah,
kind of
artists do that.
a copy of a photo, then that's a painting, and that's definitely a painting. So, and this is from a book, by the way, these images are from a book called The Commissar Vanishes, which I own, and it's a great book. It's got some awesome examples, not just visually, but also in library books. One of the things librarians, one of their duties was they would get, like not every morning, but every so often you get a piece of paper and it says you're to go to this book on the shelf, and on this page, blank out this name in ink. And then so they'd have to pull the book off the shelf and then blank out the name, or sometimes cut it out. And so there's tons of examples of that also in the book. So the book it's a big, like almost it's not quite a coffee table book, but it's oversized and has lots of images. But it's really good at providing that it's not just images, it's also the written word. And again, that's where Orwell gets his whole idea. All right, so let's talk about the German assumptions. They're going into Russia. What are their assumptions? Okay. Well, they assume they're very force-oriented. They're focused on the Red Army. And they expect to destroy the Red Army very soon after they enter the country. Yes, sir.
Can you give us a quick, where we left off last was they're both invading Poland, so how did they fall?
Okay, yeah, so they both invaded Poland. They split Poland roughly down the middle. And from 1939 until 1941, there's trade between the two countries. Hitler's getting a lot of raw materials. That was his biggest thing he's getting from the Soviets. And the Soviets, in some cases, are getting manufactured items. And Stalin has absolutely convinced himself that there's no way the Germans are going to invade because they need all this stuff I'm giving them, right? They need all this stuff to keep fighting the French and the British. Well, French have been knocked out, so the British, who are holding out on their islands, right? And so the attitude is, there's no way that he's ever going to go to war with me because he needs me. I'm providing him things. Which, kind of raises the question, well, if I just take your land, I can have your things. So that's kind of, it's kind of short-sighted. decided to say, oh, he needs my stuff. Well, I'll just take your stuff then, you know, I mean, so, but Hitler, or rather Stalin, no one can ever explain exactly what the man was thinking, okay? That he's just absolutely convinced, no, I'm gonna be okay. It's gonna be fine, no one's gonna attack me. And why he believed that? Is it whistling past the graveyard? Is it, you know, what's going on? But for, like I say, for 2 years, they have a very good relationship. And he really thinks he's safe. By all accounts, he's, yes, is he doing things with the army and so forth? Yeah, but he's not really preparing to invade. Because of course that becomes the excuse. Oh, they were preparing to invade. Not when you look at what the Red Army looked like in 1941. This is not an army preparing to invade Germany. Now, long term, the communist idea always was to take over the world. I mean, if that's what you're talking about, well, yes, they were going to invade you in 100 years or whatever, okay? But there's no imminent threat. So again, why Stalin was lulled into this false sense of security, no one has ever sort of been explained. I mean, Stalin, guys like Stalin are just so hard to get your head around in like a psychological sense. Like, what's going on with this guy? What does he think? Why does he think the things he does? I mean, because it's too easy to say, oh, he's insane. Well, nah.
It's really hard to profile.
Yeah, he is. He really is hard to profile. I mean,
It's on a spectrum. He always changes.
yes. Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking it, on a spectrum. Yeah. And he's not irrational. That's the thing. Hitler really is kind of irrational. I would really go so far as to say Hitler is touched, as the old expression was. He's touched. Because some of his things are just like, all right, I'll say this. So he's obsessed with killing Jews. Okay, this obsession, right? He is so obsessed with killing Jews, instead of taking trains and putting supplies in them and getting them to his men on the Eastern Front, he's diverting trains just to send Jews to the death camps. That's past just hating somebody into the realm of insanity. You've got guys literally running out of things on the front line, and you're more concerned with killing Jews? That's irrational. Okay, I mean, you could say everything that these guys are doing is irrational, but I mean, that's really cuckoo from my point of view. Whereas Stalin is much more rational, self-concerned, maybe narcissistic, but ultimately Stalin cares about Stalin, and everybody else is whatever.
He also cared about his parents,
Yeah.
because he had like some marks.
Yeah, he had some issues there too.
Yeah, and he like little alteration.
Yes,
To
yes.
look
Exactly.
respectable.
So, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I went off on a tangent
No, that's
there,
good.
but, okay.
Don't worry.
So, again, we're force, we as the Germans are force-oriented. We're gonna destroy the Red Army well forward, because they're waiting to invade us. That's what all the German army is being told. They're gonna invade us in any second, so we gotta hit them first, okay? That's number one. Number two, we assume that the communist regime in the Soviet Union has no popular support. And ironically, this is largely true. But the Germans then managed to do something to completely negate this. Does anybody know what they do to completely negate this?
Invade in the winter.
No.
No, they start killing civilians.
They start killing civilians. The very people who hate the communists because they've been oppressed for 20 years, we just start randomly murdering civilians who are not Communist Party members or Jewish or any of the other groups we hate. Oh, but that's right. Oh, wait a minute.
They're gypsies.
Well, them too.
Slavs.
We hate Slavs. And every Russian is a Slav. So we hate them. So this is, again, please.
I'm taking a Nazi Germany class. I'm like, they hated it. I mean, he hated everyone.
Yeah. Basically, unless you were German or Germanic,
And then also, like, if you weren't,
you're toast.
good stock or whatever,
Yeah.
like eugenics.
Yes.
Oh,
Oh, they're
yeah.
very into eugenics. Yes.
That would just kill a lot of people.
Yeah, very into eugenics. Yeah. And as we know now, so in Europe, there are really only two what they call Hoplan groups. This is, if you've ever done the 23andMe or one of these things, anybody ever do that? Where you do a scraping of your inside of your cheek and then you mail it in and they tell you what you are and so forth. There's only pretty much two Hoplan groups in all of Europe. There's one that's kind of Germany West, and there's one that's kind of Germany East. That's it. So they're all, there's a couple exceptions. The Basques, the Finns, and the Hungarians tend to have weird traces of other things. And the theory is that those groups, like 2,000 plus years ago, have some Asian roots. Because we know their language, all three of those languages are not Indo-European languages. The Basque language, which is in northern Spain, the Finnish language, and the Hungarian language. Those are actually languages that belong to the Asian language group. But there's been 2,000 years of intermarriage, so very few people in those countries still have the genetic markers from Asia, but their languages are from Asia. So,
Trace through culture.
yeah, you can trace it more through language and culture than, because my wife is Hungarian, partly Hungarian, and we did her test. No, she's Central and Eastern European.
She's all white.
Yeah. So,
She's
but
boring.
yeah, no, that's the thing. We did the genetic testing, and I always thought I was a quarter German, 3/4 Polish. Turns out I'm a quarter German, 3/4 Polish. Come on, man, nothing cool, nothing, not like. Oh, I was a little Neanderthal and Denisovian. That was my big claim to fame. I'm a Neanderthal.
I know someone who's 100% Irish.
Yeah, I can believe that.
That's-
Yeah, I can believe that.
That's inbred, I believe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that might be what that's called.
I got
But
surprised with mine.
what's that?
I got surprised with mine.
What did you? Do you mind sharing?
I got 17% Filipino.
Whoa, that is interesting.
Yeah. And
Because
I'm like,
you're
somebody's
maybe from
lying.
Mexico?
Yeah,
Okay.
Mexico, Central Mexico. And
Wow,
I'm like,
how did
somebody's lying to me
Filipinos-
over here.
Yeah, how did Filipinos get to Central Mexico?
At the
That's
same time, we
interesting.
both got screwed by Spain and America.
Well, yeah. But I mean, still, how did they get there?
It's probably an interesting story there.
That
Yeah,
is
I'm like,
probably
somebody's lying to me over here.
wow.
Asking some questions.
Probably a few hundred years ago, they imported maybe some Filipinos to
Oh,
Mexico.
but I'm like
That doesn't make
70%.
sense. That's a lot. Yeah, 17% would
That's
be.
like recent.
Yeah, that is. Or one whole branch was brought over. So 17% would be, hang on, that's more than one great grandparent. Because one great grandparent would be 12.5%. So that's 17% is more than one great grandparent would have been if it's not spread out. If it's,
And we
if it's
discovered
unified.
that my grandfather's mother may have Filipino blood because her last name is Hebreo, and that's really popular in the Philippines.
Okay, so maybe that's where it comes from. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, mine was totally boring.
I was surprised. Yeah, I'm like, somebody's lying to me.
I was hoping for something cool. I was hoping to turn out to be, I don't know, something other than German and Polish, but no, I'm German and Polish. Yes.
Like Mongol jeans,
Yeah, some Asian or something cool, but
Yeah,
no.
because
I thought
they
that
focus
Eskimo.
a lot on-
Yeah, Eskimo. That would have been funny. Anyway, so they were right, but then they managed to screw this up. They assumed no, communists are not popular, but then when you start randomly shooting people, everybody goes, hey, you know what? I knew what the rules were under the communists. If I didn't do certain things, I didn't get shot. With these guys, they just shoot people randomly, okay? The offensive itself kicks off late. Why does it have to kick off late? Well, the Italians. Mussolini, who has, since he rose to power in the early 1920s, has been trying to recreate the Roman Empire. That was his long-term goal. Old Benito, by the way, Benito Mussolini, here's a little trivia for you. Benito Mussolini was named after, does anybody know who Benito was? Juarez. He was named after Benito Juarez. His father was a big fan of Benito Juarez.
Oh, yeah.
And he named him, I'm not making this up, you can look it up. He named him after Benito Juarez.
The most beloved president of Mexico.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. Because I always wondered, Benito, that's not very Italian. Yeah, that doesn't sound Italian. And that's why he was named after Benito Juarez. I don't know if his middle name was Juarez, but I know the first name is Benito after Benito Juarez. Anyway, so Benito Mussolini's trying to recreate the Roman Empire. So he grabs Libya, and then he grabs Ethiopia, which was, he barely beat the Ethiopians, who were like using almost like flintlock rifles. Okay, so it was ugly. He decides he's going to grab Albania, Greece, and Yugoslavia, because they're just across the Adriatic Sea. So I just pop over, I'll grab it. Manages to grab Albania relatively peacefully, relatively easily. Then decides to go for Greece and Yugoslavia and gets beat. I mean, he gets beat badly. So now he's calling calling Berlin, hey, Adolf, I need some help down here, buddy. Hitler's about to kick off the spring campaign in Russia. We've got to divert a good chunk of the army south to pull his fat out of the fire before we can actually do the invasion. So the invasion goes off basically 2 months late. The invasion of the Soviet Union goes off about 2 months late. They don't invade till June, they're planning to invade in April. This is one of those many what if. What if the Germans had invaded in April? Would they have taken Moscow before the snow set in instead of looking at Moscow through binoculars because they're that close? You know, that story that supposedly, I forget if it was Rundstedt or one of the senior German generals, is literally standing on a hill and he can see red square through his binoculars, but he can't get there. Okay, and then it's all downhill after that, right? So the what if here is 2 months earlier, do they take Moscow, and how does that change the whole battle? My take on it is, okay, let's say they take Moscow. Who cares?
You go for that.
Okay, so do you think Joe Stalin's gonna wait in Moscow with his hands up and surrender? Come on now. He's on the last train out of town, baby. The last train out of town. Joe Stalin's on. Boop. And they just set up shop somewhere else and keep fighting. So does it alter the war? Yes, of course it alters the war. Does it win the war? No. Okay. So I still think the invasion of Russia
And also
fizzles.
to defend the front, I mean, for how long you wanna,
Exactly.
it's impossible, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. And so this is one of those problems. And then we've got the railroad problem. And the railroad problem is twofold. Number one, the gauge, and the gauge is the distance between the rails, is different in Russia than it is in Western Europe. Now, you might say, what the heck? Where's these smart general staff officers? Don't they know this? And the answer is, yes, they do. And they say, don't worry. We'll capture all the Russian trains and just run them right over the rails. No problem. Well, as you know, the Russians, as they pull back, they take everything with them, and anything they can't take with them, they burn. So, good luck. And then, I'm sorry, were you about to ask?
It's very similar, like in the 1812 Russian campaign, they brought.
Yes, it is. And that's not an accident. That is not an accident.
What's not
The Napoleonic invasion of Russia and the German invasion of Russia, there's a lot of similarities between the two. Because the Russians fall back on what they know. And they do, in some ways, the same tactics they did back in 1812, they do in 1941.
Colts devastating the soldiers, both of those.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Okay.
but this time we're gonna succeed because we have Thor.
Yeah, well, we have tanks.
I was gonna say the tanks were freezing for this, but the horses were dying for Napoleon.
Exactly. But we've lulled our, see, again, people do this all the time. Oh, no, we're smarter. The French lost in Vietnam in 1954, but we're Americans. We're smarter than the French, okay? The Soviets lost in Afghanistan they left in 1988. But we're not gonna do that because we're smarter, we're Americans.
Speaking of 1984, it is crazy how I saw something saying that all of the people in the Soviet Union thought they were like completely winning that war in
Oh, yeah.
Afghanistan, like the entire time.
Oh yeah, absolutely, because the propaganda is blaring out. And then if you weren't in the occupied area, yeah, you thought we were winning the whole time, please.
They're actually telling them they weren't fighting Afghanistan.
I'm sorry, were you mentioning Afghanistan or were you talking about it? Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
Soviets.
Okay, I thought you were talking about the 1941. Okay, so yes, you're right. Afghanistan, most people didn't even know what was going on. And the few that did, it's this heroic victory. We're just basically going in there to help the good Afghans, the communist Afghans, you know. We're helping them, yeah. It's like a peacekeeping, it's like peacekeeping.
But then they would drop the bodies off of dead soldiers in the middle of the night thinking nobody will see this happening and ran.
Right, all kinds of crazy stuff, yeah. So that the Soviet-Afghan war was, it was a disaster.
Did the U.S. start to enter while that was still happening, or did we start?
No, we were supplying the Mujahideen,
Okay.
usually through the CIA or through another nation, but we were supplying them pretty heavily. Charlie Wilson's War, if you're interested, the book is better than the movie.
Okay. I
There's
was
a
just
book,
thinking
yeah.
about watching that movie.
The movie's good, but the book is even better. And it talks about our support for this whole, it also talks about Charlie Wilson and his personal issues, which is a whole other thing. But yeah, I mean, we were supplying them, yeah. So here's the other problem with the railroad. So once they have burned most of their stuff, the attitude is, okay, well now we might as well just re-gauge everything. So we'll just move the rails out. I think the Soviet gauge was narrower and the European gauge was wider. So, all right, fine, well, we don't have the rolling stock, fine. We'll just open it up and we'll fix it. So they do that. And what they discover is German engines won't work in Russia. Why not? During the Russian winter, it gets so cold, they couldn't get enough steam pressure in a German engine. You might be saying, well, how is that? Soviet, Russian engines, the firebox was insulated so that the heat did not dissipate through the metal hull on the sides. So the firebox was insulated so the heat stayed in and you could build up enough steam pressure. German ones weren't insulated. So what happened, and you know how metal dissipates heat really quickly, okay? The heat just permeates right out. And they could never get enough steam up. They could go maybe 10, 20 miles per hour, but that is absolute high speed for a German engine used in Russian winters. They could never go more than between 10 and 20 miles an hour. Whereas a Russian engine, because it had that insulation around the firebox, you could get up enough steam, you could go 40, 50 miles an hour. And so that's a huge thing. They can still run their trains, but they're gonna run them awfully slowly. And how many more trains do you have to send when it takes you 4 times as long to get the stuff there?
Yeah, and also
So that's a logistics nightmare.
the longer distance.
Absolutely, and the longer distance.
Yeah,
They're not used to long distance. Germany is relatively small. You can get wherever you need to get in Germany relatively quickly. Not when you're going all the way to almost Moscow. And one last thing is the primitive road network. The roads in the Soviet Union were horrible. And the reason they were horrible is, who had cars in the Soviet Union?
Stalin and anti-Soviet.
Only high Communist Party officials.
Doesn't sound very communist to me.
You clearly are calling the wrong communist. What's that? I'm sorry?
Sounds like North Korea.
Yes, exactly. Some very same thing.
Cities with buildings that are empty, no
Yep.
cars in the streets.
Yeah, absolutely. So we don't need roads. Why would we need a great road network? Just dirt roads are fine. Gravel maybe once in a while because hardly anybody uses them. And when they're not being used by that, okay, it's farmers with a horse-drawn cart. They don't need a super highway. They don't need the Autobahn to move a farmer's cart. You can move them on a dirt road. Well, the Germans coming from Germany, which has a very good road network. In fact, they have the Autobahn, which actually started before Hitler. That's another one of those myths. Oh, Hitler built the Autobahn. It actually started in 1929. But does Hitler expand it? Yes, he loves the Autobahn. he thinks that's a great idea and he expands it.
And that's gonna tell me Mussolini didn't have a trains one time.
You're right. So again, they come from a country with some of the best roads in the world, arguably. I bet you, if you were to go mile for mile, I bet the German roads in the 1930s were better than the American roads. But remember, the interstate highway system is Eisenhower. That's post-war.
They were definitely better.
Yeah. So they come from that, and then there's suddenly everything's just dirt roads that the minute it rains, mud. So the Germans are just, oh, what's going on here? We weren't expecting this. Okay? So that's just some of the assumptions and problems that come very quickly before we even get to the killing. Okay? Is this kind of stuff.
You would think if you want to invade a country, you should like know the landscape.
You wouldn't you think?
Yeah.
Well, I will point out, we're not going to talk about it, but I will point out, when we're going to invade France in 1944, nobody figures out about the hedgerows. If you know about the hedgerow problem in Normandy, and what a fiasco that is for about 2 months after the invasion.
Can they not get through it? It's like
Yeah, because they aren't just shrubs. Everyone thinks, oh, it's a bunch of shrubs. Oh, no. They're basically like these little fortifications around everybody's little field so that your animals can't get into my field and eat my crops, or my animals can't get out and eat your crops. Or no, it's very much, this is my little field and you can't have it. And so they're almost like these little fortifications. Yeah, and 2 months that holds us up. 2 months we were held up by the hedgerows until an army sergeant figures out a real easy way to get through. So, but that's
Build
another.
them up?
What's that?
Build them up?
No, he creates this adapter. It's called a rhinoceros or rhino, and you put it on the front of a tank and you drive it in, and it basically just plows out a big chunk of the hedgerow, and that's how they eventually figure out how to do it. But it's a great story, and it's an example of American ingenuity, where Americans will just say, okay, this is a problem, what we're doing ain't working. Somebody come up with something, and it's a sergeant. It's an ordnance sergeant. It's not some colonel, it's an ordnance sergeant who says, hey, I got an idea. I'm a welder. And there's all this scrap metal on the beaches that we don't have anything for. Let's try this. And he tries it and it works. And again, I made this point earlier, but I just want to reemphasize again, every campaign the Germans had done prior to the invasion of Russia had been quick.
Why Denmark just last one day defending them?
Yeah, Denmark basically just fired like a couple shots and said, okay.
They didn't turn around.
Yes, okay. We weren't cowards. We put up a fight, we fired a couple rounds.
Shouldn't the jokes be for Denmark then?
You went, well, but think how small Denmark is. I think the entire country has like 1 million people. I mean, it's the size of Harris County. So, I mean,
Take it.
yeah. Okay. But again, as I mentioned earlier, and so I just want to show you exact numbers. He got everything so easy. And then he got Austria without firing a shot. He got the Czech half of the Czech Republic without firing a shot. And Slovakia, the other half of Czechoslovakia, is a client state. So they have an official government and everything, but in actuality, they're calling Berlin saying, what do I do today, boss? Okay? He gets all that. He gets 3 things without even firing a shot. And then this is his track record up to 1941.
My ego would be high too.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm a narcissistic lunatic, but I gotta be honest, I'm with you. If I had managed to get 3 countries for free, and this is my track record, I'd be pretty willing to say, yeah, okay, this isn't gonna be that bad. Maybe I'll take a few months. But, come on. I mean, we're awesome. Good numbers. We're awesome. And again, it undermines the German General Staff, which is inherently a cautious, conservative, I don't mean politically, but personally conservative organization. Don't take risks if you don't have to. Make sure you've thought through the process. That's what the German General Staff's all about, right? So they keep telling him, no, don't do that, it's gonna go badly. Well, their track record is, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. They're over 12 in predicting the outcome. German General Staff has told them 12 times, don't do that, it's gonna go badly. they've been wrong every single time. So when they tell them, hey, Russia, this is going to be a problem, especially the logistics. That's the one thing the German General Staff is going nuts about before the invasion of Russia. Like, this is a long distance. Like, the logistics are going to be insane on this. And Hitler's like, whatever, guys, just make it happen. You guys are 0 for 12. I'm going to take your word for anything. They were right, but okay. Now, let's go backward before we go forward. After Poland is gobbled up, in 1940, the Russians turned their attention on Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and they gobbled those 3 nations up. Very small nations. Again, Denmark, kind of small. Harris County, kind of small. Maybe 1 million people each. Okay? So those nations are gobbled up. They will not get their freedom again until 1990. Yeah. Yeah, they are part of the Soviet Union. They're not client states, they are part of the Soviet Union. So here's where Joe Stalin is going to start to believe this myth of invincibility. He got half of Poland for almost nothing. He got these 3 for almost nothing. And then he will turn his attention on Finland. He will turn his attention on Finland. And he will suddenly find that Finland is not quite as easy as he thought. Now, what is the difference between Estonia, Latvia, Poland, etc., and Finland? Well, number one, terrain. The area that is the border between the Soviet Union and Finland is absolute, it's forest. It's wilderness. And I was just looking at, I had found this really neat collection of maps. It was one of these kind of maps where they show you the world and they show like the percentage of people who do this, percentage of this, percentage of this. Finland is the most forested country in Europe today. When they write, it was just Europe. This was just a European map. It wasn't a world map. And they should, it was percentage of, it was color coded, how green. The deeper the green, the more trees, the lighter the green. It's the most heavily forested country in Europe in 2023.
Sounds
Yes.
nice.
Well, they did just European Russia. They didn't do the steppes.
Okay.
So they stopped. So if it's the most forested country in 2023, in 1940, it's even going to be more forested. And so here's the other thing. For 20 years, the Finns have been part of Russia, Imperial Russia. It used to be called the Grand Duchy of Finland. Okay? And that was a title the Tsar had. The Tsar, among his many titles, he was also the Grand Duke of Finland. When the Finns get their independence, they then spend 20 years preparing for a Russian invasion. So they've got bunkers dug, they've got a whole defensive plan, and their senior leader is a guy named Mannerheim, who has basically, he's the George Washington of Finland. Okay, I think it's Paul Mannerheim. I think it's a von Mannerheim. He might be one of those bonds. He has spent he was a general in the Tsarist army, ethnically German, because remember, the borders used to be in different places and stuff like that. So there's a group along the Volga River in Russia that are called the Volga Germans, because when Peter the Great was the Tsar back in the late 1600s, early 1700s, he wanted to get more skilled craftsmen and stuff like that into Russia, because he basically is tired of all these serfs that are worthless and can't do anything. So he convinces several German princes to encourage people to move, and he gives them free land, and he gives them all kinds of rights that the regular Russians don't have, and they settle along the Volga River, and they're called the Volga Germans. So Mannerheim's family were Volga Germans, and then he entered the Russian army, served like 30 years in the Russian army. He was an older dude already, and then decides, I'm not staying in the communist Soviet Union. I really don't want to go to Germany. What's left? Oh, Finland. He becomes the president of Finland. Well, by 1940, he's the commander-in-chief. They've separated commander-in-chief from president. So he's like the senior general. He's like 70-something years old already. But he spent his whole last 20 years planning for this invasion. And so when the Russians invade, they just get hammered. Okay, their casualties are horrific. The Finns do an amazing job considering they have almost no modern equipment. That's another thing. Finland today has the highest gun ownership, civilian gun ownership in Europe other than Switzerland. So even to this day, the Finns are very defense oriented, and as you know, they just joined NATO. So not surprising that they should have done it 40 years ago, 50 years ago. But anyway, so the Finns just bloody the Russians' noses badly, okay? And this should be a wake-up call for Stalin. Like, all those generals I killed, maybe the Red Army isn't as good as I thought. But Joe Stalin quickly decides, nah, that's not it. It's the fault of the generals who actually did the invasion. We'll shoot a couple of those guys. Everything will be fine.
Just execute some more generals.
What's that?
Just execute some more generals.
Yeah.
Instead of the
Yep.
AAR, we'll just
Yeah, exactly.
We'll do the next
We'll do an
one.
AAR. It's Komazov and Rokossovsky and yeah, those guys. It's all their fault. Okay.
You won the lottery.
Yeah, yeah. You're going on an all-expense paid trip to Siberia. Congratulations. I hear it's lovely in summer. So, what are the Germans expecting then as they go into Russia? Well, here's Hitler. And I still say, if he didn't start murdering people, maybe that actually would have been true. The average Russian hates Stalin. He hates communism.
He's Georgian. He can't even.
Yeah, he's not even a Russian. That's right. He's a Georgian. He's a foreigner, right? And here's one of the senior generals, Colonel General Franz Halder.
What's with everyone in these short wars? They're always saying the war is gonna be over quick.
I know.
Nobody's gonna die.
I know. It's this obsession. And because the Germans are only good at short wars, that's probably why.
I feel like every time somebody says it's a short war, it's a long war.
And then they countered what, Sweden in like a lunch break or something?
I don't know if it was quite that quick, but pretty quick. Pretty
Probably
quick.
Denmark.
I mean, but 2 weeks is very short. I mean,
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe too long.
You're better off. Look, the first Gulf War, 1990, and the Spanish-American War are two examples in our history where we planned for a long war, but partly because we planned for a long war, partly because of other conditions, we got a short war. You're much better planning for a long war
Not for a short.
and getting the opposite than doing that. Because if you plan for a short war, it almost invariably becomes something else.
In fact, it's jinx. Like,
Yeah, it's kind of like you're jinxing yourself. Yeah.
Like saying Macbeth in the theater.
Yeah, I'm with you. But how convinced is Stalin that the Germans are not going to invade, remember?
No.
He has made it clear to the Red Army, under no circumstances do you cause a war where you're not just going to be shot, your wife is going to be shot, your kids are going to be shot. I'm going to shoot everybody who's ever met you. Okay?
But
This
then
is...
I see a military mechanic brigade.
No!
No, they ain't.
Yeah, exactly. So this is actual communications from a frontline Soviet Union to their headquarters the night, it's like the 21st, that's 22nd is when the invasion happens. So this is the night of the invasion. Come on. Almost all of the frontline Soviet units that are on the border are captured without firing a shot. They are more terrified of Stalin than they are of the Germans. And so most of these units will literally just stand there while the Germans drive right up to them, assuming that the Germans didn't realize they'd accidentally crossed the border. Oh, comrade, tоварищ, no, the border's over there. And then they're pointing a gun at you saying,
It's
no,
an invasion.
I meant to do this. But that's how terrified. They're more terrified of Stalin than they do of the enemy. And so what happens as a result is Partly that, and partly Stalin then gives a no retreat order. You're going to fight to the last man. So you have a series of encirclements where humongous Soviet forces are captured. How big? Well, during the Gomel campaign, the Germans captured 80,000 Soviets. Smolensk, 110. Northern Front, 120. This is all 1941, guys. This is all the campaign in 1941. Białystok, Minsk.
So the Germans capture all those.
They capture all those prisoners.
Wow.
They most likely wouldn't have done anywhere near that many if they would have retreated, right?
Yeah. I mean, if they had retreated or put up a decent fight, I mean, think how different that campaign is. So now the question is, what do we do with them all? That's a lot of prisoners.
Yeah.
And Hitler issued an edict on the 30th of March, 1941, to tell you exactly what's going to happen.
Shoot the bastards.
No,
Concentration camp?
that's too complicated.
Concentration camp?
Now build roads.
So feed them.
The water.
It's not good.
Prisoners are collected in what could crudely be called camps. Very crudely be called camps. This is an example. Just string some barbed wire and jam some guys in. Put a bunch of machine guns on the outside so nobody can escape. They have captured, by December, 3.9 million prisoners. 3.9 million. By February, mostly through disease and starvation. Very little actual shooting. Mostly disease and starvation. By 1945, anybody know what happens to that 100,000 at the end of the war?
They get killed.
No.
Defect.
Oh, they tried to defect. Doesn't work.
Stalin.
They handed back over to Stalin, and he sends them to the Gulag. Because if they were true Soviet men, they would have fought to the death. So these guys survived 4 years of horrific conditions. They had other POWs. Remember, these are just the guys captured in fall of 41. And immediately after the war, they're sent to the Gulag.
And they died.
And most of them die in the Gulag. At most, 10,000 of these guys will survive. Out of 3.9 million, at most, 10,000 will go home at some point. Most likely after Stalin dies. Because there's an amnesty after Stalin dies, and they let a whole bunch of people out of prison.
That's amazing.
Okay, well, we're out of time. We'll resume next week and keep talking about it, and it's not going to get any nicer. It's going to suck the whole way through.